before any city lifted its walls from the plain, before a scribe pressed signs into wet clay. Part 5. There was only the low land under the first pale light of morning. The rivers had gone quiet for a while, not silent forever. 5. Because the Tigris and the Euphrates were never truly still, but quiet in the way a place becomes quiet after it has carried too much water. 5. The mud held the shape of retreating currents. Thin sheets of silt lay over the ground like a soft grey skin. In the hollows, 5, shallow pools reflected the brightening sky, and along their edges, reeds leaned together in the faint wind. 5, whispering, as if they were repeating something older than language. This was the southern Mesopotamian plain, wide, flat, and difficult to read. 5, to a passing eye, it might have seemed almost empty. No towers, no gates, no carved kings, no temples rising above the horizon. Only earth, water, 5, birds, insects, and the slow breathing of a landscape that had been shaped again and again by rivers. Yet beneath that surface, 5, under mud baked hard by the sun, under layers of silt left by forgotten floods, 5, there may have been traces of lives that did not yet know the word civilization. A mound in the distance could look natural until one came closer. 5. It might be only a swelling of earth, softened by time, half covered with scrub and salt. But inside such mounds, 5 later generations would sometimes find the remains of walls, hearths, pottery, ash, broken tools, and floors built over older floors. 5. Each layer was a quiet sentence. Each buried surface marked a time when people had stood there, eaten there, feared the river, trusted the river. 5. And returned after the water changed the shape of their world. River plains are generous, but they are never harmless. They give fish, reeds, clay, 5, grain, and movement. They also take away houses, fields, paths, and graves. The same water that feeds a village can erase it. 5. The same silt that makes soil fertile can hide a settlement so completely that after enough centuries, even memory begins to soften around it. 5. Somewhere below the dust, there may have been footprints sealed before they could become history. A child carrying reeds. 5. A woman pressing grain into a jar. A man watching clouds gather above the river bend. Nothing grand enough for legend yet. 5. But real enough to leave a mark in the earth. And so, at the beginning of this journey, we do not begin with a king, or a battle, or a finished city. 5. We begin with the land itself. We begin with mud cooling under dawn light, with reeds at the edge of old channels. 5. With low mounds sleeping beneath dust. The earth is quiet here, but not empty. It is holding something. 5. And perhaps the first question is not who built the earliest cities, Font a 5, but why so many ancient peoples remembered water before they remembered their own beginnings in the first place. Flood stories usually end at the moment when the waters fall away. The ark rests, the mountain appears. A bird returns with a sign of life. 5. The survivor steps onto wet ground, and the world somehow begins again. In many traditions, this is where the great tension releases. Destruction has passed, the chosen few have lived. The sky has opened, the earth is no longer covered. But if we stay with the story a little longer, 5, quietly, without rushing past the silence, another question begins to rise. What happened the next morning? 5. Not in the language of miracle or punishment, but in the slow human reality of mud, hunger, memory, and loss. Who gathered the scattered animals? 5. Who found seeds that could still grow? Who remembered where the old river paths had been? 5. Who taught children the names of places that no longer looked the same? If the flood marked the end of one age, 5, then something else must have marked the beginning of the next. This is the forgotten space that most flood stories leave behind. 5. Across the ancient world, water often stands as a boundary. In Mesopotamia, 5, the flood divides the time before kingship was renewed from the time after. In later biblical tradition, 5. It separates a corrupted old world from a fragile new one. In Greek memory, in Indian tradition, and in many other cultures, flood is not only a disaster, it is a doorway. Behind it lies a vanished order. Beyond it lies a rebuilt world. 5. Yet the rebuilding is usually hidden from view. We hear of the warning, the vessel, the rising waters, the survival. 5. And the covenant or blessing that follows. But the long transition is harder to see. It would not have been dramatic in the same way. 5. It would have been made of small acts repeated day after day, drying tools, clearing silt, finding clean water, marking seasons again. 5. Choosing where to settle, deciding which memories should be carried forward and which would fade into grief. 5. Perhaps this is why the flood remained so powerful in human imagination. 5. It gave ancient people a way to speak about endings too large to describe directly. It also gave them a way to imagine renewal. 5. But between ending and renewal, there is always a passage, and that passage may be where the deepest mystery lives. 5. For the listener drawn to ancient records, lost civilizations, and the first cities of Sumer. 5. The question is not simply whether one flood can explain every story. That would be too narrow and perhaps too easy. 5. The more haunting question is why so many traditions remembered civilization as something that had to begin again. 5. If there was an age after the waters, then it may have been an age of survivors carrying fragments. Fragments of skill, fragments of sacred memory. 5. Fragments of older places, already sinking into story. And from those fragments, slowly, something began to take shape on the plain. 5. Long before the first city walls ever appeared. And then, after ages of mud, memory, and scattered settlement, the cities begin to appear. 5 sounded. Not suddenly as if dropped whole from the sky, and not without older roots beneath them. 5. But still with a force that can feel startling when we look back across the long silence. On the southern Mesopotamian plain, places such as Eridu, Uruk, and others rose from layers of earlier life. Their walls, platforms, streets, workshops, temples, 5 and storehouses made human organization visible in a new way. The land that once looked open and quiet now held centers of power, ritual, labor, 5 and memory. A city is not only a large settlement, it is a different rhythm of existence. People come and go. Grain is counted. 5. Water is directed through canals. Clay is shaped into bricks, jars, tablets, and seals. Workers gather for tasks too large for one household. Priests tend sacred spaces. Rulers claim authority. Scribes begin pressing marks into wet clay, leaving signs that outlive their hands. 5. Trade reaches beyond the local field. Names, numbers, offerings, debts, and deliveries begin to settle into record. 5. This is why the earliest cities of Mesopotamia still feel mysterious. They do not appear from nowhere, but when they become visible, 5, they already carry many complicated things at once. Writing, temples, administration, craft, irrigation, long-distance exchange, 5, and the first shapes of kingship. It is as though many quiet inventions, tested over generations, 5, and suddenly gather in one place and become something larger than their separate parts. Uruk, especially, gives the impression of a world-changing scale. 5. Its monumental buildings and administrative systems suggest not simply people living together, but people being coordinated, measured, fed, organized. 5. And remembered. Eridu, older and more sacred in later Mesopotamian imagination, seems to look even farther back, toward a beginning wrapped in water. 5. Ritual and divine association. Between these places, the first city becomes both a physical fact and a symbolic question. What made this possible? 5. The simple answer is agriculture, water control, population growth, and trade. These matter deeply. Without food surplus, labor, and cooperation, 5, no city could last. But even when we name these things, another layer remains. Who carried the knowledge forward? 5. How long did people experiment before the city became clear? How many unnamed villages, shrines, canals, 5, and seasonal gathering places prepared the way before writing finally made the process visible? 5. The first cities may be our earliest strong evidence of civilization, but evidence is not always the same as origin. 5. A footprint in mud does not show the whole journey that led to it. A tablet does not preserve every voice that came before the scribe. 5. It only catches one moment, one hand, one need, after countless earlier moments have already passed into the soil, into habit, into memory. 5. And into silence. So perhaps the first cities were not the beginning of the story. 5. Perhaps they were the moment when a much older story finally rose high enough above the plain to be seen beneath the morning sky. 5. You do not need to hold every name in your mind. As this journey moves forward, it will pass through old rivers, buried mounds, broken tablets, 5. Temple ruins, flood stories, and memories that changed shape as they traveled from one generation to another. Some names will be familiar. Sumer, 5. Eridu, Uruk, the Tigris, the Euphrates. Others may arrive softly and then fade again, like lights seen from a distance across a dark plain. 5. There is no need to grasp them all. This is not a test of memory. It is a slow walk through a question. If you are listening late at night, 5, or while resting, or while working quietly, you can let the details come and go. The story will keep its own path. Like a river, it may bend, 5, disappear behind reeds, and return again where the land opens. If you drift for a moment, the mystery will still be here when your attention returns. 5. The age we are looking for is not a simple place on a map. It is not one ruin waiting with a sign above its gate. It is a layered thing. Part earth, 5, part story, part record, part silence. We will approach it the way archaeologists approach an ancient mound, not by tearing everything open at once, 5, but by moving carefully through levels. A layer of mud, a layer of ash, a floor, a broken jar, a seal, a tablet, a name. Then beneath that, 5, something older. This forgotten age may not give itself easily. It may appear only in hints, in the way flood stories divide time, 5, in the way first cities seem to gather knowledge already formed, in the way ancient people imagined teachers, sages, 5, and divine figures arriving with the gifts of order. None of this needs to be forced into certainty. It can remain calm. It can remain open. 5. A 5. A mystery does not lose its power simply because we treat it with care. And if some of these ideas feel distant, that is all right. 5 distant things can still be meaningful. A star, a ruin, a half-remembered story. 5. A line on a clay tablet. Each can guide the mind without asking too much from it tonight. For now, let the plain stay quiet around you. 5. Let the reeds move in the wind. Let the first light touch the river channels and the low mounds that still sleep under dust. 5. We have not yet entered the temples. We have not yet opened the tablets. 5. We have only stood at the edge of the question and looked out across the land where memory and mud are almost the same color. Soon, 5, we will follow the water backward into the stories themselves. We will begin in Mesopotamia, 5, where some of the oldest written flood traditions were pressed into clay. And then we will let the circle widen, 5. Because long before the first cities explained who they were, many ancient peoples had already remembered a world that was once covered by water. 5. In Mesopotamia, the flood does not enter the record as a single simple tale. It appears like an old image seen through several layers of clay. But the details change from text to text, language to language, century to century. 5. But the shape remains familiar. The gods decide that the world will be covered by water. One man receives a warning. A vessel is prepared. 5. Life is carried through destruction. And after the storm, time begins again. In the older Sumerian tradition, 5, the flood stands, near the edge of memory connected to kingship and the strange division between the world before and the world after. Later, 5, in Akkadian stories such as Atrahasis, the disaster becomes more detailed. Humanity has grown noisy and troublesome to the gods. A decision is made. 5. But one god, moved by concern, sends a warning to a wise man. He is told to build, to preserve, to survive. The story is not only about water, 5. It is also about instruction at the last moment, about knowledge given before everything familiar disappears. Then, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, 5 descends the flood memory appears again through Utnapishtim, the distant survivor whom Gilgamesh seeks after the death of his friend. 5. Utnapishtim tells of a secret warning, a great boat, sealed doors, rising waters, 5, and a silence after the storm, so vast that the world itself seems emptied. Birds are released. The vessel comes to rest. A sacrifice is made. 5. The survivor is changed forever, standing between human memory and something almost beyond human time. For listeners drawn to Sumerian records, 5. This matters, because these are not late inventions floating without roots. 5. They are part of an old Mesopotamian habit of dividing history around a flood. Before the waters, there are ancient rulers, distant cities, 5, and a kind of time that feels larger than ordinary human life. After the waters, kingship returns, cities rise again, 5, and the world becomes recognizable in a different way. This does not prove that every flood story describes one exact event. 5. Ancient texts are not photographs. They are memory, theology, politics, poetry, and warning pressed into clay. 5. But the persistence of the pattern is difficult to ignore. The survivor is not merely lucky. He becomes a carrier. He carries life. 5. But also instruction. He carries the possibility that something from the older world might pass into the new one. 5. And this is where the forgotten age begins to appear in shadow. 5. The Mesopotamian flood stories do not spend much time describing the long work after the waters, yet they imply it. 5. A world survives only if something is preserved. Seeds, animals, rituals, names, the knowledge of how to build again. Perhaps that is why the story feels unfinished, as if the most important labor begins after the final line. From these oldest written shadows, 5, the question widens. Mesopotamia remembered the flood in clay, but it was not the only land where water became the line between one age and another. 5. Across the long memory of early humankind, the same kind of water appears again and again, far beyond Mesopotamia. In the biblical story of Noah, 5, the flood becomes a moment of judgment and renewal. The old world is washed away, and a small remnant survives inside a vessel built by warning. 5. Obedience and strange patience. When the waters withdraw, the earth is not simply dry again. It has become a new beginning, marked by memory. 5. Promise, and the fragile task of living differently than before. In Greek tradition, 5, Deucalion and Pyrrha survive a flood sent to cleanse a corrupted age. Afterward, 5, they repopulate the earth through an act that is both symbolic and mysterious, casting stones behind them from which new people arise. 5. The story is not Mesopotamian in detail, yet emotionally it moves through the same deep pattern. A world grows old, water covers it, survivors emerge, and humanity begins again under changed conditions. In India, ancient traditions tell of Manu, warned by a divine fish about a coming flood. He prepares a boat, survives the waters, 5, and becomes connected with the renewal of life and order. Here again, the flood is more than weather. It is a threshold, 5. Knowledge is preserved through warning. Life crosses from one age into another. Across parts of Mesoamerica, 5 flood memories also appear in different forms, often linked with earlier creations, destroyed worlds, 5, or ages that ended before the present human order. The details vary widely, and they should not be pressed into one rigid shape. Still, 5. The emotional rhythm is familiar. Water closes one chapter. A different world follows. 5. This pattern does not require us to say that every culture remembered the same historical flood. 5. That would flatten the stories and ignore their local meanings. Rivers flood, coastlines change, storms come, communities are lost. 5. But human beings also turn catastrophe into meaning. They remember not only what happened, but what it felt like. Fear, helplessness, survival, guilt. 5. Gratitude, and the uneasy hope that life might continue. Flood stories often carry moral or spiritual weight. They speak of worlds out of balance, gods or divine forces disturbed, humanity being tested, corrected, or renewed. But beneath those meanings, there is also something very human. 5. Water is one of the few forces that can make a familiar world vanish overnight. A field becomes a lake, a path disappears, a house turns into debris. 5. A homeland becomes something that must be remembered rather than entered. So when distant traditions speak of water between ages, 5, perhaps, they are not offering one simple clue, but many. They are telling us that ancient people understood catastrophe as a kind of boundary. 5. Before it, there was one order. After it, another had to be made. And if so many peoples remembered the waters, 5. The next quiet question is whether the earth itself ever gave them reasons to remember. To understand that possibility, 5, we can leave the mythic shore for a moment and look toward rivers, seas, storms, and changing ground, where memory could begin in real disaster. 5. Rivers do not need to cover the whole earth to change the memory of a people. For a small community living near water, 5, one violent flood can feel like the end of the world. The field that fed them is buried under silt. 5. The house built by a father or grandfather is pulled apart and carried downstream. The path to a neighboring village disappears. Graves are opened. 5. Animals are lost. The river that once meant life becomes, for a season, something almost divine in its power. 5. Mesopotamia was especially shaped by this tension. The Tigris and the Euphrates gave the plain its fertility, but they were never gentle servants. 5. Channels shifted. Their floods could arrive with force. Water spread across low land, left new layers of mud. 5. And changed the places where people could farm, travel, and settle. A village might survive one flood and move after the next. 5. Another might vanish under deposits so ordinary, looking that centuries later only a careful excavation could tell that people had once lived there. 5. When archaeologists find flood layers in ancient Mesopotamian sites, those layers do not automatically prove the great flood of any single tradition. 5. A local flood can leave a real mark without explaining every myth. But it shows something important. 5. Water was not an abstract symbol to the people of the river plains. It was a recurring force, remembered in walls repaired, fields remade. 5. And stories retold beside hearths. Beyond Mesopotamia, 5. The end of the Ice Age brought long changes that would have felt enormous to those living through them. As ice melted, seas rose, coastlines moved. 5. Lowlands were drowned. Places where people may have hunted, gathered, fished, or buried their dead slipped beneath water little by little. 5. Or sometimes through sudden storms and surges. To later generations, the memory of a lost shore could become a story about a drowned world. 5. This is how disaster becomes story, not all at once and not with perfect accuracy. First there is the event itself, rain, river, storm, sea. 5. Collapse. Then there are survivors trying to explain what happened. Then children hear the story from elders. 5. Then the story is joined to ideas of gods, warnings, sin, renewal, or fate. After enough time, 5. The original flood may be impossible to separate from the meaning that grew around it, but that does not make the story empty. 5. Myth can preserve the emotional truth of disaster, even when it no longer preserves the exact date, place, or scale. It can hold the memory of fear, 5. Loss, survival, and beginning again. In this way, an old tale may be less like a map and more like a lamp carried through generations, still burning. 5. So perhaps some ancient flood traditions began in real waters, rivers that broke their banks, seas that climbed over old ground, 5 storms that erased familiar places. Yet the deeper mystery remains. Once the waters withdrew, once the mud dried, 5. Once the survivors stood on altered land, what came next? Flood stories often know how to describe terror. They remember the darkening sky, 5. The rising water, the warning that comes too late for most, the vessel prepared in fear and faith, 5. The mountain or hill where life finally rests again. They know the sound of rain and the loneliness after it, 5. They know the moment when a bird is sent out over the water, searching for a branch, a shore, any sign that the world is returning. But then, 5. Very often, the story becomes quiet. The survivor steps onto land, makes an offering, receives a promise, or begins a new line of descendants. 5. The great drama has ended. The waters have withdrawn. The listener is allowed to breathe again. Yet if we remain there, 5. In that damp silence after the ending, the most difficult part of the story is still ahead. A world does not rebuild itself because the ground is dry. 5. Someone must find food. Someone must decide which seeds can still be planted, which animals can be kept alive, which tools can be repaired. 5. Which shelters can stand, and which places are now too dangerous to enter. Children must be calmed. The dead must be remembered. Pipes are. Old paths must be tested. New boundaries must be marked. The stories of what happened must be told carefully. 5. Must, because those stories may become instructions for those who are born long after the flood has become a sacred memory. 5. This is the hidden chapter that flood traditions usually pass over. Not because it was unimportant, but perhaps because it was too long, too ordinary, 5, and too human to fit inside a single tale. Rebuilding is not one moment. It is 1,000 small decisions made under a changed sky. 5. It is the slow return of fire, bread, shelter, ritual, and trust. If survivors carried anything from the older world, 5, they would have carried more than life. They would have carried knowledge, how to shape clay, how to store grain, how to read seasons. 5. How to share water. 5. How to remember the names of ancestors and warn children about places where the river had once risen higher than anyone believed possible. 5. And if that knowledge endured, it may have moved quietly through generations before it ever appeared as a city wall, a temple platform, a canal, 5, or a tablet. The first cities, then, may not be the opposite of the flood story. They may be its distant continuation. 5. They may represent the visible end of a much longer recovery, built by people whose names were never written down. So the mystery begins to shift. 5. The flood itself remains powerful, but perhaps the deeper question is what happened after survival. 5. Who lived in that dim passage between catastrophe and civilization? Who carried the fragments? Who taught the next generation how to begin again? 5. When the world no longer looked the same. To follow that question, 5 for the sea. We have to leave the great waters behind and look for the people who remained in the quiet afterward. 5. The people who lived after catastrophe may not have looked like the founders of history. 5. They did not stand beneath carved monuments with their names cut into stone. 5. They did not leave royal inscriptions announcing that they had restored the world. Many of them may have lived in small groups close to water. 5. Close to animals, close to the fragile edges of fields that had to be cleared and planted again. Their work would have been quiet. 5. A wall repaired with mud brick. A roof covered with reeds. A cooking place cleaned of silt. A storage jar set upright again, if it had survived. Food would have mattered more than memory at first, because hunger does not wait for stories. Yet even while people searched for grain, roots, fish, 5, and animals, memory would have been moving among them. Someone would remember where the old settlement had been before the water changed the ground. 5. Someone would remember which plants returned first after a flood, which clay held firm, which riverbank collapsed, which path led to higher land. 5. These were not grand myths yet. They were practical memories, carried in the voice, repeated because life depended on them. In such a world, 5, kinship was a kind of shelter. Families, clans, and small communities held together what no single person could preserve alone. 5. One person might know how to shape a blade from stone. Another might know how to mend a basket. Another might remember the seasons, the stars. 5. Or the behavior of animals before heavy rain. Survival was not only strength, it was shared attention. 5. This is the part of the forgotten age that leaves almost no face behind. Archaeology may find a hearth, a tool, a wall line, a burial, a layer of ash. 5. But it rarely gives us the full voice of the person who lived there. 5. The people who mattered most to the rebuilding of the world may have vanished into the simplest remains. Their names are gone. 5. Yet their choices may have made later civilization possible. Before kings, there were people deciding where to sleep safely. Before temples, 5. There were places where the living remembered the dead. Before tablets, there were stories told beside fire, warnings passed to children. 5. And grief shaped into words that could be carried. It is easy to look for the beginning of civilization in great buildings and written records. 5. Because those are the things that survive clearly. But perhaps the true beginning was softer. A family returning to a damaged field. 5. A group sharing stored grain. A child learning why the river must be respected. 5. These survivors, without monuments, may be the first shadowy figures in the passage between flood memory and the city. They did not only remain alive. 5. They held together the small necessary knowledge from which a world could slowly be made again, and as their shelters grew steadier, 5. The next question became what they chose to preserve, not only in their hands, but in memory itself for those who followed. 5. High. If life crossed the flood in a vessel, then knowledge may have crossed in quieter containers. A handful of seeds wrapped in cloth. A stone blade kept dry. A memory of when the river usually rose, and when the soil was ready to open. 5. A way of tying reeds, so that a roof would not collapse in rain. A rule about sharing water. A warning about planting too close to the low ground. 5. These things seem ordinary, almost too simple to be called sacred, yet without them no world could begin again, to rebuild after disaster. 5. People needed more than courage. They needed instructions inherited from those who had watched the land carefully. 5. They needed to know which grains could be saved, which could be eaten, and which must be kept back for the next season. 5. A hungry family might want to consume everything, but a surviving community had to think beyond the night. Seed was food, but it was also tomorrow. 5. To protect it was to believe that tomorrow still existed. Animals required the same kind of patience. People had to remember where herds moved. 5. How young animals behaved. Which creatures could be kept near a settlement, and which signs in the air or soil suggested changing weather. 5. Such knowledge was not written in books. It lived in hands, habits, and repeated speech. A child learned by watching, an elder corrected by gesture. 5. A toolmaker showed the angle of a strike. A builder pressed mud and straw together until a wall could stand. In ancient life, 5. Practical knowledge and sacred knowledge were not always separate. The calendar of planting could belong to ritual. 5. The rising of a star could tell farmers when to prepare the field. The storage of grain could be tied to offerings, taboos, duties. 5. And the authority of those trusted to remember. What we call survival skills may have felt like gifts received from ancestors, spirits, gods, fight muds, or mysterious teachers from an earlier age. This is why the idea of lost knowledge has such power. 5. It does not need to mean shining machines or vanished technologies beyond imagination. It can mean the fragile chain of knowing how to live. 5. How to build above damp ground, how to keep fire, how to measure time, how to settle disputes before hunger turns neighbors against one another. 5. How to tell a child, in the right season, which seed must not be eaten. Perhaps the true ark was not only wood sealed against water. 5. Perhaps it was memory itself, carrying seeds, tools, rules and rhythms through darkness into another age. In that sense, every saved seed, 5 sharpened edge, and remembered warning was a sacred object, humble enough to fit in the palm, yet large enough to change the future. 5. And once such knowledge was preserved, certain people would naturally become its guardians. Not kings yet, not scribes yet, but elders, healers. 5. Ritual speakers, skilled makers, and quiet figures whose authority came from remembering what others could not afford to forget. Before tablets. 5. Memory had to breathe. It lived in the voice of an elder repeating the old paths through a changed landscape. 5. It lived in the rhythm of a chant spoken at planting time when the first seeds were placed into damp earth. 5. It lived in warnings told to children beside the fire, not as entertainment only, but as a map of danger, duty, and belonging. 5. Fun. Long before a scribe pressed a sign into clay, people were already preserving worlds inside story. 5. Forgotten. In the forgotten age between disaster and the first cities, some people may have carried more than ordinary memory. 5. They may have known the names of ancestors, the seasons of birds, the healing plants near water, the proper words for burial. 5. The old places that should not be disturbed, and the signs that the river was changing its mood. A community could survive with strong hands. 5. But it also needed minds trained to remember. These figures would not yet be priests in the later temple sense. 5. There may have been no great sanctuary, no high platform, no written liturgy, no official archive, but there could still have been sacred authority. 5. A healer who knew which roots eased pain. A storyteller who recited the beginning of the people. A ritual speaker who marked the return of rain. 5. The death of an elder, or the first grain placed in storage. Their power came from continuity. 5. They held yesterday in a world where yesterday could disappear under mud. Oral tradition is sometimes treated as fragile. 5. But it can be remarkably strong when a community depends on it. Repeated stories become memory houses. Songs carry sequences. Ceremonies make knowledge visible through movement, sound, gesture, and timing. A warning about floodwater may become a tale of divine anger. A lesson about planting may become a sacred festival. A remembered leader may become larger with each generation. Fight funds and human until human skill and mythic presence begin to overlap. This is not deception. It is how memory survives when there are no books. The past is protected by being made meaningful. Later, when Mesopotamian cities began to write, they did not create memory from nothing. They inherited older currents. 5. Clay tablets fixed certain stories into visible form, but the stories themselves may have traveled for ages by mouth, ritual, and repetition. 5. Behind the written record, there may have been countless voices, now gone, shaping what would eventually become sacred history. 5. Perhaps this is why ancient records often feel as if they are looking backward into a mist. They speak of times before ordinary time. 5. Of knowledge granted, kingship descending, sages teaching, and waters dividing the world. These images may not be simple reports, 5, but neither are they empty fantasy. They may preserve the outline of a deep human need. Someone had to remember for everyone else, 5. And once memory keepers existed, later generations may have imagined them as something greater than human, as sages, teachers, 5, or beings who carried wisdom from before the flood into another dawn. Later ages did not always remember their teachers as ordinary people. 5. In Mesopotamian tradition, wisdom often comes from figures who stand close to the edge between human and divine. The Apkallu, the ancient sages, 5, are remembered as bearers of knowledge, associated with the ordering of life, the arts of civilization, 5, and the mysteries that belong to the time before the flood. Some traditions describe them in strange, symbolic forms, connected with water, temples, 5, and the deep source of wisdom. They are not simply village elders in the stories. They are larger, older, and touched by the world of the gods. 5. A careful reading must hold several possibilities at once. The traditions say that knowledge was given, guarded, or carried by extraordinary beings. 5. Scholars often understand these figures as mythic symbols of priestly learning, ritual authority, 5, and the ancient prestige of scribes and temple culture. In that view, the sages represent the idea that civilization itself has sacred origins. 5. Writing, measurement, purification, building, and ritual were not casual inventions. They were gifts with divine weight. And still, 5. Another question remains open. Could some of these legends also preserve a blurred memory of real knowledge keepers from an earlier age? 5. Not as proof of one hidden race or one simple answer, but as a human possibility. A healer who remembered medicines after disaster. 5. A builder who knew how to raise walls above wet ground. A watcher of stars who could mark seasons when fields had to be planted again. 5. A speaker of old stories who carried the memory of a world lost to water. Over generations, such people could become more than ancestors. 5. They could become sages. This is how memory often grows. A person becomes a lineage becomes a tradition becomes a myth. 5. The further the story travels from the original life, the more luminous the figure becomes. Human skill is lifted into sacred language. Watching a 5 practical teaching becomes divine instruction. The one who helped people survive is remembered as the one who brought order from the ruins. 5. For viewers drawn to watchers, Anunnaki, Apkallu, and ancient teachers, this is where the mystery becomes especially deep. 5. The ancient world repeatedly imagined knowledge as something received from beyond ordinary life, sometimes from gods. 5. Sometimes from beings between worlds, sometimes from survivors who had crossed a boundary that others could not cross. 5. These stories do not need to be flattened into literal certainty to remain powerful. Their power lies in the pattern. After catastrophe. 5. Knowledge matters more than almost anything. The one who knows how to rebuild becomes a guardian of the future. 5. And if that guardian is remembered for long enough, beneath enough layers of fear, gratitude, ritual, and time, he may no longer look entirely human. 5. From these remembered teachers, we can now turn toward the places where their knowledge may have taken root. The small settlements, old mounds, Fiked, early houses, and pre-city worlds where rebuilding first became visible in earth, beneath the quiet dust of southern Mesopotamia. 5. Long before a city has a name on a tablet, it may exist as a rise in the ground, across the ancient Near East. Archaeologists often find the past in mounds. From a distance, a tell can look like a natural hill, rounded by wind, sun, rain, and centuries of dust. 5. But when its sides are cut carefully, or when a trench opens into it, the hill reveals that it is not simply earth, it is time stacked upward. 5. One floor above another, one wall built on the ruin of an older wall. Ash, pottery, bones, tools, bricks. 5. And broken hearths pressed together until human life becomes a landscape. This is one of the quiet secrets of early civilization. 5. The first cities did not always begin on empty ground. Many rose above older settlements. 5. And those settlements sometimes rose above still older traces. A famous city may be the final visible shape of a place that had already been lived in. 5. Abandoned, repaired, flooded, burned, and rebuilt many times before its name entered written memory. 5. Imagine an archaeologist moving down through such a mound. Near the top, there may be later buildings, clearer walls, better pottery, perhaps evidence of organized streets or public spaces. Lower down, the signs become simpler: a house floor, a storage pit, a clay oven, a handful of tools, a child's burial beneath a room. Then deeper still, perhaps only a scatter of sherds, a packed surface, a stain of ash, a line where a reed wall once stood. Nothing in these deeper levels announces itself as a lost age. There is no carved sign saying, 5. Here begins the world before the city. Yet this is exactly why the mystery feels so human. The pre-city world is not absent. 5. It is often hidden under the city itself. In Mesopotamia, where mud brick was the common building material, 5 to time could bury people gently and completely. Walls weathered back into earth, roofs collapsed, new families leveled the remains and built again. 5 floods laid down silt, wind brought dust. Each generation stood a little higher than the last. 5, sometimes, without knowing how much older life rested beneath their feet. A settlement mound is therefore not only a ruin, it is a memory made of soil. 5. It shows that human places grow by repetition, not only by invention. People return because water is near, because the land is useful. 5. Because the dead are there, because the old place still feels like home. So when we speak of the first cities, we should imagine them with deep roots. Beneath temple platforms and city walls, there may have been small rooms, cooking fires, storage jars, and people whose names were never written. The city remembered them in its own way, by standing over them, not as glory, but as patient survival beneath the dust. 5. And from these buried beginnings, we can begin to ask what daily life may have been like before streets, gates, kings. 5. And monuments gave the settlement a larger face. Before walls divided the inside from the outside, before kings placed their names on clay or stone. 5. Life on the plain moved with smaller rhythms. A village might have begun as a cluster of mud brick houses, low and practical. 5. Built from the same earth that held the fields. The walls would have been shaped by hand, dried by sun, patched after rain, and slowly worn by dust. 5. Roofs of reed and timber gave shade in the heat. Courtyards held tools, baskets, grinding stones, sleeping mats, and the quiet disorder of daily life. 5. Nothing about such a place would seem grand from a distance, yet every corner carried the work of survival. In one house, 5 grain might be stored in jars or bins, protected from damp, insects, animals, and hunger. In another, someone shaped clay, repaired a blade. 5 twisted fiber, or sorted seeds. Smoke rose from cooking fires. Children learned by watching rather than being formally taught. 5 dogs moved near doorways. Goats, sheep, or cattle stood close enough to be heard in the early morning. 5. The village was not separate from the animal world. It breathed with it. The seasons gave the year its shape. There was a time to prepare ground. 5 a time to plant, a time to wait, a time to harvest, and a time to worry over what had been stored. Rain, river levels, heat, pests. 5. And disease could change everything. In such a world, memory was not decorative. To remember the right season, the right soil, the right warning sign. 5. Could mean the difference between fullness and hunger. Ritual may have entered daily life quietly. A small offering placed near a hearth. 5. A burial beneath or near a home. a gesture made before planting. A story repeated when the moon returned to a certain shape. 5. These acts did not require a great temple. They made the ordinary world feel held by meaning. They joined food, death, birth, weather, 5, and hope into a pattern that could be carried. There may also have been exchange. A shell from far away, a stone not found nearby, a decorated vessel. 5. A tool whose material traveled farther than the person who used it. Even before cities, people were not completely isolated. 5 paths connected settlements. Goods moved, news moved, marriages, visits, disputes and alliances drew small communities into wider human webs. 5. A traveller arriving near dusk could bring obsidian, salt, a rumour of flood, or a new way to shape a handle. Small things carried distance inside them. 5. And distance slowly changed the village. This is where civilization may have begun most deeply. Not in the first throne room, 5, but in repeated acts that became dependable. Storing grain, repairing walls, sharing labor, marking seasons, honoring the dead. 5. Teaching children the shape of a tool and the danger of a riverbank. Long before streets had names, life already had structure. 5. And from that quiet structure, something larger could slowly gather, until the village began to reach beyond itself. 5. Into wider patterns of shared life. A village does not become a city in a single morning. It changes slowly, almost invisibly at first. 5. Through habits that begin to reach beyond one household. One family becomes known for shaping better pots, another for making sharper tools. 5. Someone learns to work stone, brought from far away. Someone else becomes skilled at weaving reed mats, sealing storage jars. 5. Or repairing walls after rain. Over time, certain hands become trusted for certain tasks. This is specialization. 5. But in the beginning, it may have looked very simple. A neighbor called because she knew how to do one thing better than most. 5. Trade widened that small world. A village near good clay might exchange vessels with people who had access to stone. 5. A settlement close to marshland might offer reeds, fish, or birds. Another might send grain, wool, fine tar, or crafted objects along paths that followed river channels and dry ridges. The object that arrived from elsewhere carried more than usefulness. 5. It carried news of other places, other skills, other ways of living. Every exchange quietly taught a community that it belonged to a larger pattern. 5. Water deepened that pattern. In the river plains, farming depended not only on patience, but on cooperation. Channels had to be cleared. 5. Banks had to be repaired. Fields needed controlled flow, and that work was too large for one family. When people gathered to manage water, 5. They were also learning how to organize labor, settle disputes, divide responsibility, and remember agreements. 5. The canal was not only an irrigation feature. It was a social lesson cut into the earth. Shared ritual spaces may have worked in a similar way. A small shrine, a special platform, a burial area, or a gathering place used at certain seasons could draw people together beyond daily household life. 5. When communities meet in the same place again and again, memory thickens there. Stories attach to it. 5. Authority gathers around those who know the proper words, the proper timing, the proper offerings, or the older meaning of the place. From this, 5. Leadership could emerge without looking like kingship. An elder trusted during disputes, a skilled organizer during canal work. 5. A ritual figure who remembered ceremonies, a household head whose stores helped others through a difficult season. 5. These were not yet palace rulers commanding a city, but they show how influence could grow from usefulness, memory, generosity, fear, 5, or sacred association. At some point, a village becomes more than a village, not because one wall is built, but because relationships become layered. 5. Work is divided, water is shared, goods move, ritual binds, Decisions affect people beyond one family. 5. The community begins to carry a weight greater than its houses. 5. This slow accumulation is easy to overlook because it does not announce itself like a finished city. 5. Yet it may be the hidden preparation behind the first urban world. Long before Sumerian streets filled with scribes, workers, priests and traders, 5. Smaller communities were already practicing the patterns that would one day become human civilization. 5. Perhaps the forgotten age is difficult to see, not because it never existed, but because it did not leave behind the kind of evidence people expect. 5. Many imagine lost history as a single vanished empire buried beneath sand or sea, waiting to be uncovered whole. 5. With towers intact and answers preserved in stone. But the deeper past rarely survives in that form. Time breaks things apart, rivers move. 5. Mud covers walls, wood rots, reeds disappear, names fade before writing can hold them. 5. What remains are fragments scattered across landscapes, a buried floor, a cluster of storage jars, a canal line visible only from above. 5. Traces of burned grain, a small shrine beneath later buildings. The forgotten age may exist inside those fragments. 5. Archaeology often reveals history as accumulation rather than sudden appearance. Beneath a famous city there may be older settlements. 5. Beneath those settlements, traces of earlier occupation. Layer below layer, human life gathers slowly in the earth. 5. Each generation builds partly on the remains of another, often without fully knowing what lies beneath its own feet. 5. A temple rises where a smaller sacred place once stood. A large settlement spreads over older villages. 5. A canal follows a path first shaped long before scribes began recording labor and taxes. In this way, 5. The first cities can seem sudden only because they are the first stage of civilization that becomes clearly visible. Writing appears. 5. Monumental structures rise. Administration leaves records. Kings begin naming themselves. But by the time these things exist, 5. Countless quieter developments have already taken place over centuries, perhaps longer. This is important because it changes the shape of the mystery. 5. The hidden age between flood memory and urban civilization may not belong to one lost kingdom. 5. It may have been a broad transition spread across many communities, each carrying part of the rebuilding process. One village remembers irrigation. 5. Another preserves ritual. Another develops trade paths, food storage, or social rules strong enough to survive hardship. Together, 5. These scattered acts slowly prepare the ground for the urban world that later generations would call civilization. 5. The evidence for such a passage is incomplete, and perhaps it always will be. Archaeology gives glimpses rather than total pictures. 5. Myths preserve emotional truths more easily than timelines. Ancient records begin late. 5. After many earlier lives have already passed beyond direct memory. Yet when the fragments are viewed together, 5. A pattern begins to emerge. Civilization may have grown from a long hidden recovery rather than a sudden beginning. 5. This possibility does not remove the mystery. It deepens it. The forgotten age becomes less like a missing object and more like a buried process, still visible in layers of mud brick, worn pathways, abandoned hearths, and settlement mounds sleeping beneath later cities. And as villages slowly expanded into more connected worlds, certain places may have started drawing people together for reasons beyond survival alone. 5. Before kings ruled from palaces, there may already have been sacred centers where memory, ritual, and community gathered on the open plain. 5. Long before a city announced itself with walls and gates, there may have been places that people returned to, simply because the place itself mattered. 5. A rise of ground above the floodplain. A circle of stones darkened by old fire, a platform built carefully from packed earth and mud brick. 5. A spring, where water emerged clear even in the dry season. Such places may not have been permanent settlements at first. No crowded streets, 5. No markets, no royal compounds. Yet people came back to them again and again, carrying food, tools, offerings, animals, stories, and memory. 5. In the ancient world, geography was rarely neutral. Certain places felt marked. A bend in the river, a hill that remained dry during heavy flooding. 5. A grove, a cave, or a mound, older than anyone could explain, could gather meaning over generations. A 5 card, communities separated by distance, might still travel toward the same location at certain times of year, following seasonal rhythms older than writing itself. Fires would be lit, food shared, burials remembered, agreements renewed. 5. Children introduced to stories that belonged not only to one family, but to many. 5. Perhaps this was one of the earliest forms of social organization larger than the village. Not rule through armies or law. 5. But connection through return. The repeated act of gathering creates identity. A place visited once is only a location. 5. A place visited for centuries becomes sacred geography. These early centers may also have helped preserve continuity after catastrophe. 5. If floodwaters changed the land, if villages moved or disappeared, a remembered gathering place could still anchor people to the past. But 5. Even if the route became difficult, even if the surrounding world changed shape, the sacred site remained a point of orientation. 5. To arrive there again was to reconnect with ancestors, rituals, and shared memory. 5. Archaeology sometimes finds traces of such repeated gathering long before formal cities fully emerge. Layers of ash from old fires, 5. Animal bones from communal meals, rebuilt platforms, carefully arranged objects. The evidence is often incomplete. 5. But it suggests that people were organizing themselves around meaningful spaces before urban civilization became visible in its later form. The 5. This possibility changes the way we imagine the beginning of cities. A city may not have begun simply because people wanted to live close together. 5. In some cases, people may first have gathered for ritual, memory, trade, or seasonal ceremony. 5. And permanent settlement slowly formed around those repeated acts. The sacred center came first. 5. And daily life accumulated around it over generations. In that sense, civilization may have grown not only from practical survival, 5, but from shared meaning. The place where people returned became the place where relationships deepened, knowledge circulated, disputes were settled. 5. Marriages arranged, stories preserved, and identity renewed. The first sacred places were likely quiet compared to later temples. 5. No towering ziggurats yet, no royal inscriptions, only firelight, offerings, worn paths through dust. 5. And people arriving beneath the open sky, because the place itself had become part of memory. And once communities began returning together in ritual, 5. Memory itself could be shaped into something stronger than survival alone. Ritual is one of the oldest ways human beings teach memory to survive. A story told once can fade. A warning spoken only in fear may be forgotten when the danger passes, but a ritual returns. 5. It comes back with the season, with the moon, with the river, with the first grain, with the burial of the dead. 5. With the gathering of families at a place already known to their grandparents. Because it is repeated, it carries memory farther than ordinary speech. 5. In a world before writing, this repetition mattered deeply. A community could hide practical knowledge inside sacred action. 5. A planting ceremony could preserve the correct time to open the soil. A harvest rite could remind people how much grain must be stored. 5. A purification with water could carry an old memory of danger, cleansing, or survival after flood. 5. A shared meal could renew alliances between families who needed one another when the river rose or the fields failed. 5. Ritual turns memory into movement. People do not only hear the past, they perform it. They walk to the same place. They light the same fire. 5. Kaid. They speak the same names. They place offerings where offerings were placed before. Children watch the gestures before they understand the meaning. 5. And later, when they grow older, the gestures become a language already living inside them. 5. This is why the oldest records of a people may not have been records in the way we imagine them. They may not have begun as tablets, lists, 5, or royal inscriptions. They may have begun as repeated acts under the open sky, a circle of people facing the river. 5. A chant recited when water withdrew, a story of destruction told at the time of renewal, a quiet reminder that the world had once been broken. 5. And that order had to be restored carefully, together, and with reverence. Flood memory fits naturally into ritual because floods themselves move in cycles. Water rises, covers, withdraws, 5, and leaves behind both ruin and fertility. To ancient communities, this could feel terrifying and generous at the same time. The land is damaged, 5, then made rich. The old surface disappears, then new life grows from the mud. It is easy to see how water became a symbol not only of destruction, 5, but of cleansing, rebirth, and the fragile return of order. Over generations, 5, such rituals could become stronger than the event that first inspired them. The original flood, storm, or loss may blur, but the ceremony remains. 5. It teaches people when to gather, what to fear, what to honor, and how to begin again. As settlements grew larger, 5. The people who guarded these rituals may have gained greater authority. The keeper of the calendar, the speaker of sacred words, 5, and the one who knew when offerings should be made, could become central to community life. From this quiet authority, 5, the path begins to lead toward Mesopotamia's temples, where memory, labor, water, 5, and sacred order would gather in a more visible, public, and enduring form. When people imagine the first cities of Sumer, 5, they often imagine kings first. Thrones, laws, armies, banners, commands carried through crowded streets. 5. Yet some of the earliest signs of organized urban life in Mesopotamia seem to gather around something older and quieter. The temple, 5. Before palaces dominated the skyline, sacred spaces may already have stood at the center of community life. A raised platform above the floodplain, 5, storerooms attached to ritual buildings, workers carrying grain into temple compounds, priests or ritual officials keeping track of offerings, 5, calendars, labor, and distribution. The sacred center was not only a place of worship, 5, it may also have been a place where society learned to organize itself. This is one reason temples matter so deeply in early Mesopotamian history. 5. They joined practical life and sacred meaning together. Grain collected for ritual could also feed workers. 5. Water management could be tied to religious duty. Seasonal festivals helped gather scattered communities into shared rhythms. 5. The sacred institution became a place where memory, economy, authority, and survival met under one roof of mud brick and reed. In later centuries, 5 kings would place their names proudly on monuments, claiming divine approval and military power. But before royal authority fully emerged, 5, priestly and ritual authority may already have shaped how communities cooperated. 5. The person who understood the calendar knew when planting should begin. The keeper of offerings might oversee storage and redistribution. 5. The 5s. The interpreter of sacred order could settle disputes, guide ceremonies, and maintain continuity between generations. 5. This does not mean temples alone created civilization. Villages, canals, trade, labor, and agriculture all mattered. 5. Yet the sacred center may have helped bind those separate activities into something larger and more stable. 5. A city needs more than houses close together. It needs shared meaning, trusted systems, repeated coordination. 5. And places where people feel connected to forces greater than themselves. In some of the oldest Sumerian traditions, 5 cities themselves seem tied to divine order. Eridu, Uruk, Nippur, and other sacred centers were not imagined merely as convenient settlements. 5. A 5. They were places where heaven and earth touched through ritual, whether understood literally, symbolically, or politically. 5. This belief gave sacred institutions tremendous influence over daily life, for listeners drawn to the mystery of civilization's beginnings. 5. This creates an intriguing possibility. Perhaps the first cities did not grow outward from royal power. 5. But inward from sacred gathering places that slowly accumulated labor, memory, trade, and authority around them. 5. The temple may have stood before the palace, and ritual before law. If so, then the earliest urban world was shaped not only by rulers, 5, but by those who guarded knowledge, seasons, offerings, and inherited memory. The sacred center became a container for civilization itself. 5. And around these centers, stories of wise teachers and ancient knowledge could grow stronger over time. 5. Until the keepers of memory no longer seemed entirely human in the imagination of later ages, around sacred places, 5. Knowledge could take on a different shape. A person who knew how to measure a field was not only practical. 5. A bud. He could make the earth fair between families. A person who knew when to plant was not only observant. 5. She could help a community survive the hungry season. A person who remembered the correct words for a burial, a flood warning, 5, or a seasonal gathering could seem to stand closer to the hidden order of the world than everyone else. Over time, 5. Such people could become teachers at the edge of memory, not necessarily kings, and not always priests in the later temple sense. 5. But figures whose knowledge made them difficult to forget. They may have known how to count grain, read the stars, shape clay, purify water, 5. Guide labor, settle disputes, or preserve stories of the time before. Their wisdom was useful, but it was also surrounded by reverence. 5. Because in the ancient world, useful knowledge often felt sacred. This is where later traditions of sages, divine messengers, 5, and culture bringers become so fascinating. In Mesopotamian memory, the Apkallu stand close to this mystery. 5. They are remembered as wise beings linked with deep knowledge, ritual order, and the arts that make civilization possible. In other traditions, 5 different figures appear: watchers, ancestral teachers, divine envoys, or mysterious bringers of law, agriculture, writing, and sacred custom. 5. The names change, but the pattern returns. Someone brings order, someone teaches. 5. Someone carries knowledge from a realm beyond ordinary life into the human world. A cautious view sees these figures as symbols. 5. They may represent priestly lineages, temple, learning, inherited ritual, or the belief that civilization came from divine wisdom. 5. This reading is valuable because ancient people did not separate religion, politics, farming, and knowledge the way modern people often do. To them, 5s, the act of measuring, building, planting, and remembering could belong to the sacred order, and yet the stories still leave a quiet opening. 5. Perhaps behind some of these shining figures were real teachers, memory keepers, healers, builders, 5, and sky watchers, whose lives were later enlarged by myth. A person who taught a community how to survive after disaster might, after many generations, 5, be remembered as more than human. Gratitude can turn into legend. Legend can turn into divine biography. This does not need to become a hard claim. 5. It is enough to notice the pattern. Sacred places gather people. Gathered people preserve memory. Preserved memory creates authority. 5. Authority gathers stories around itself, until the teacher becomes a messenger from the deep past. 5. So when ancient traditions speak of beings who taught humanity how to measure, plant, build, count, and remember, 5. They may be preserving more than fantasy. They may be keeping the emotional outline of a time when knowledge felt like rescue. Not loudly, 5, but patiently through water, clay, labor, ritual, and remembered instruction together. From these sacred centers and their remembered teachers, 5. The path now bends back toward the river plain, where Sumer slowly begins to take shape. 5. The road toward Sumer was not drawn first by kings or scribes, it was drawn by water. 5. And the Euphrates, the Tigris and the Euphrates, move through the land like restless powers, giving shape to everything around them. 5. They did not simply pass through Mesopotamia, they made Mesopotamia possible. Their waters carried silt from distant highlands, 5, spreading fertility across low ground, where dry earth might otherwise have hardened under the sun. Along their banks, people found fish, reeds, clay, 5, birds, grazing land, and the promise of grain. But these rivers were never simple gifts. They were alive with change. A channel could shift. 5. A flood could come earlier than expected, or later, or with more force than memory had prepared for. 5. Water could feed a field one season and bury it the next. It could make a village rich, then force its people to move. 5. To live beside such rivers was to live with both blessing and danger, with life and loss carried in the same current. Fact 5. This is why the rivers may be seen as the first architects of civilization. They shaped where people settled, where paths formed, 5, where fields could be opened, and where communities had to cooperate. A family could plant a small patch of land alone, 5, but controlling water across a plain required many hands. Channels had to be cleared, banks strengthened, boundaries negotiated, timing remembered. 5. The river taught people that survival was not only personal, it was shared. Over time, this lesson became deeper. The floodplain rewarded attention. 5. Those who watched the rise and fall of water could plan better. Those who learnt the soil could plant more wisely. 5. Those who worked together could extend fertility beyond the river's natural reach. Irrigation was not merely a technique. 5. It was a relationship between human patience and an unpredictable landscape. 5. The same water that may have inspired fear in flood stories also taught the habits that made cities possible. Cooperation, measurement, storage. 5. Leadership, repetition, trust. Each canal cut into the earth was also a line of agreement between people. Ups. Each repaired bank showed that a community could remember yesterday's danger and prepare for tomorrow's need. In the quiet work of guiding water, 5, early communities practiced the discipline that later cities would demand on a much larger scale, with more people, more field, 5, and heavier obligations. In this way, geography became memory. The plain did not offer civilization ready-made. It asked for response. 5. It asked people to return after floods, to rebuild after loss, to read mud and reeds as signs, find order in a place that never stayed completely still. The long road towards Sumer begins with rivers, not monuments. Before the temple platform rose, before the tablet dried, 5, before the city gathered its crowds. The Tigris and Euphrates were already shaping the habits of those who lived near them. They destroyed, nourished, 5, warned, and instructed. And along their banks, generation after generation, people slowly learned not simply to survive water, 5, but to live with it each year. To live with the rivers, people had to do something that must have once seemed almost impossible. 5. They had to guide water without ever fully owning it. A river cannot be commanded like an animal on a rope. It spreads where the ground allows. 5. It cuts new paths when pressure builds. It ignores human confidence. 5. Yet early communities on the Mesopotamian plain slowly learned that water could be persuaded. A channel could lead part of it toward a field. A bank could hold it back for a while. A ditch could drain standing pools. A gate of mud, reed, timber, 5, or packed earth could slow the flow just enough to make planting possible. This was not solitary work. One farmer could clear a small ditch, 5, but a canal that served many fields needed many bodies. Men and women had to dig, carry, patch, measure, and return again after storms. 5. Someone had to decide where the channel should run. Someone had to remember which families used which water, which fields came first. 5. And what should happen when the river was low. The more useful the system became, the more social it became. Here, in the wet earth, 5, we can see one of civilization's quiet beginnings. Water management demanded coordination before there were great palaces to enforce it. 5. If a canal filled with silt, everyone downstream suffered. If one group took too much water, another group's grain might fail. 5. Cooperation was not an ideal carved into law at first. It was a practical necessity, learned through hunger, argument, repair, and repetition. 5. Over generations, canals became more than lines of water. They became lines of responsibility. The person who organized labor gained importance. 5. Far. The one who knew the slope of the land held valuable knowledge. The elder who remembered an older flood could warn others where not to build. 5. The ritual specialist who marked the proper season may have helped turn practical timing into sacred order. In this way, labor, memory, authority, 5, and belief began to lean toward one another. Perhaps civilization began partly as a response to danger. Not only the dream of abundance, 5, but the need to survive uncertainty. A floodplain gives generously, but it asks for discipline as well. It asks people to think beyond one household, 5, one harvest, one season. To control water even slightly, communities had to build habits of shared work. They had to create expectations. 5. They had to trust that others would return when the canal needed clearing again. 5. Each season tested whether agreement could hold as firmly as the bank's people raised against the current. 5. This is not the dramatic image of civilization we often imagine. No king on a throne, no army, no written law, only people standing in mud, fighted a 5, shaping the direction of water by hand, learning that survival could be organized. And once a community learns to organize water, 5, it begins to organize other things as well: grain, time, labor, memory, and meaning. The practical world slowly opens into a symbolic one. 5. Before writing became literature, prayer, royal memory, or myth, it may have begun with a quieter need: keeping count. A basket of grain had to belong to someone. A jar of oil had to be stored, moved, given, or received. 5. Sheep had to be counted when they left, and counted again when they returned. Workers had to be fed. Fields had to be measured. 5. Offerings had to be recorded, even before there were proper written words for the stories people told around fire. In the long road towards Sumer, 5, this is one of the most important changes. Memory begins to move from the human voice into objects. Small clay tokens, shaped by hand, 5, could stand for goods: a measure of grain, an animal, a jar, a quantity owed or delivered. They were simple, 5, but they allowed people to carry numbers outside the mind. A token could remember when a person forgot. It could sit in a storeroom, 5, in a sealed container, or in the hand of someone trusted with exchange. Over time, the need to record became heavier. 5. A small village might rely on memory and trust, but a growing settlement needed something more durable. When grain moved through temples, storehouses, fields, and labor groups, the old ways of remembering were no longer enough. The community needed marks that could survive argument, distance, fight, and time. Clay, so common on the river plain, became the perfect surface. Wet, it could receive a sign. Dry, 5, It could keep that sign long after the hand was gone. Even a small mark could settle a question that memory alone might leave uncertain. 5. This is why writing does not need to be imagined as a sudden gift appearing fully formed. It can be seen as a slow answer to practical pressure. 5. Before people wrote the great stories of gods and floods, they may have written numbers, amounts, names, deliveries, and obligations. 5. The first marks were not always poetic, but they were powerful. They turned daily life into record. Counting grain also meant counting time. Fields followed seasons. Labor followed calendars. Offerings belonged to certain days. The rising of stars, the return of floods. 5. The ripening of crops, and the movement of herds all had to be remembered. Administration and sacred order met here again. 5. To know when something should happen was almost as important as knowing how much had been stored. 5. A calendar could protect a harvest just as surely as a wall protected a house. There is a quiet beauty in this. Civilization may have learned to write because ordinary life became too complex for memory alone. A clay tablet, at first, 5, was not a book in the modern sense. It was a small piece of controlled memory. It held a trace of grain, work, debt, trust, and time. 5 held safely against forgetting. And as these traces multiplied, the world was preparing for something larger at last. Cities where rivers, canals, 5 temples, storerooms, workers, rituals, and records would all gather together on the plain. By the time the first city becomes visible on the plain, 5, the story is already old. Water has been watched for generations. Canals have been cleared, repaired, and argued over. 5 fields have been measured in memory before they are measured in clay. Grain has been stored, counted, protected, and redistributed. 5 ritual fires have burned at gathering places. Elders have spoken warnings. Skilled hands have shaped tools, jars, bricks, baskets, seals, 5 to 5, and small tokens of record. Nothing appears finished yet, but the pieces are moving toward one another. This is the hidden preparation age. 5. The long and quiet passage that can be easy to miss when we begin history with famous names. A city is not born from empty ground. 5. It gathers what already exists and makes it denser. It takes water management and turns it into organized labor. 5. It takes storage and turns it into administration. It takes sacred gathering and turns it into temple life. It takes memory and turns it into record. 5. It takes ordinary trust, dispute, duty, and exchange, then stretches them across a much larger human world. 5. Somewhere on the southern Mesopotamian plain, this gathering must have happened slowly. A settlement grows because the land is useful. 5. More families arrive. More grain must be stored. More canals must be maintained. More offerings are made. More workers are needed. 5. More decisions affect people beyond one household. The place begins to feel different, not only lived in but centered, not only inhabited, but organized. Perhaps, from a distance, there was no clear moment when village became city. 5. No single morning when someone looked around and knew that a new age had begun. The change may have come through repetition. Another wall rebuilt. 5. Another storeroom added, another shrine enlarged, another tablet marked, another path worn by people coming from farther away. But the city waited beneath the horizon long before it rose above it. And this is what makes the first cities so mysterious. 5. They seem to arrive with power, but their strength comes from older roots. Behind every temple platform are older sacred gestures. 5. Behind every tablet are older acts of counting. Behind every canal are older lessons in flood, hunger, and cooperation. 5. Behind every king are earlier forms of authority, softer perhaps, but already shaping human life. So as we approach Sumer, 5 Cud, we are not approaching a sudden miracle. We are approaching a threshold where hidden processes become visible. The mud brick grows higher. Fun 5. The sacred center becomes more permanent. The records become clearer. The movement of people becomes harder to ignore. 5. What had been scattered across villages now begins to concentrate, as if the plain itself is slowly drawing memory into one place. Ahead, 5 across the flat land, names begin to emerge from the dust. Eridu, Uruk, and others. They do not end the mystery of the forgotten age. 5. They give it walls, streets, temples, and voices pressed into clay. And now at last, Fucker, the 4. The first cities begin to rise from the plain under the morning light, at the southern edge of Mesopotamia, 5. Where river water once spread into marshland, before reaching the sea. There stood a city that later generations remembered with unusual reverence. 5. Its name was Eridu. Today, its remains lie quiet beneath dust and broken earth, far from the living water that once sustained it. 5. Low mounds mark the place where walls, temples, courtyards, and human footsteps gathered over thousands of years. To an outside eye, 5. It can seem almost empty now. Yet, in ancient Mesopotamian memory, Eridu was never merely another settlement. It was associated with beginnings. Archaeology suggests deep antiquity there. Long before the great empires of the region, people built and rebuilt structures on the same sacred ground. Layer after layer accumulated, each resting upon older foundations beneath it. Small shrines became larger ones. Mud brick walls rose where earlier walls had weathered away. The site carried continuity. 5. As though generation after generation refused to abandon the place entirely, even as the surrounding world changed. In later Sumerian tradition, Eridu became tied to wisdom, sacred authority, and the deep origins of civilization itself. It was associated with Enki, the god connected with water. 5. Knowledge, craft, and hidden understanding. This connection matters because it joins practical survival with sacred meaning. Water, memory, 5, and intelligence meet together there. The city is not imagined only as powerful. It is imagined as ancient in a special way. 5. Rooted near the beginning of ordered human life. For modern listeners, this creates a fascinating tension between archaeology and myth. 5. Archaeology reveals a real settlement with long occupation and ritual importance. Myth transforms that settlement into a symbolic center, a place where divine wisdom entered the human world. Neither perspective fully cancels the other. Together, 5, they create a layered image, a real city carrying the emotional weight of remembered origins. 5. Perhaps this is why Eridu matters so deeply to the mystery of the forgotten age. 5. It feels less like a sudden invention, and more like the visible surface of older memory. 5. The repeated rebuilding at the site hints at continuity stretching backward beyond clear historical vision. 5. Even the sacred stories attached to it suggest that civilization did not begin casually. It emerged from places already charged with meaning. 5. When ancient people looked back toward Eridu, they may not have been remembering one exact historical moment. 5. They may have been remembering the feeling of transition itself, the movement from scattered survival toward organized sacred life. 5. From temporary settlement toward permanence, from memory carried only in voice toward memory rooted in place. In that sense, 5. Eridu becomes more than a city, it becomes a symbol of emergence, a reminder that civilization grows slowly from accumulated acts repeated over generations. The temple rebuilt again, the canal reopened, 5. The grain counted. The stories retold beside water and fire, and while Eridu stood close to the memory of beginnings, 5. Another city farther north would eventually reveal the full scale of what urban life could become. There, on the Mesopotamian plain, 5. Orbor. The world of villages and sacred centers would expand into something larger than anything that had existed before. 5. If Eridu feels like a memory of sacred beginnings, Uruk feels like the moment that memory becomes a world. On the Mesopotamian plain, Uruk grew into something far larger and more complex than an ordinary settlement. Its expansion changed the scale of human life. Houses, workshops, temples, courtyards, walls, streets, and administrative spaces gathered into a dense urban landscape. 5. The city was not only a place where people lived close together, it was a machine of coordination, belief, labor, and record. 5. To approach Uruk in its early greatness would have been to approach a new kind of human environment. Monumental buildings rose above the flat land. Sacred precincts drew attention and movement. Workers carried materials. Craftspeople shaped pottery, textiles, metal, and stone. 5. Grain moved into storage. Animals were counted. Seals marked ownership and authority. 5. Wet clay received impressions that could outlast the voices of those who made them. This is where the mystery of early cities becomes strongest. 5. Uruk did not appear without roots. It developed from older villages, sacred spaces, trade networks, farming systems, and generations of experiment. 5. Yet, when we see it in its larger form, the difference is dramatic. The village world seems to have crossed a threshold. 5. Human life is no longer organized mainly by household and kin. It is organized by institutions, records, specialized work, shared rituals. 5. And obligations stretching across many people. Writing, or the earliest forms of it, fits naturally into this change. A large city cannot rely only on memory. Too much must be tracked: grain, labor, animals, offerings, deliveries, land, and time. 5. The marks on clay were not merely signs of cleverness. They were answers to pressure. The city needed memory outside the human mind. 5. Memory that could be stored in a room, held by an official, sealed against dispute, and read by those trained to understand it. 5. Uruk, therefore, feels powerful because it shows complexity becoming visible all at once, even though the process behind it was long. 5. It gives form to the hidden preparation age. The canal, the shrine, the storage jar, the token, the seasonal gathering. 5. Hide, and the skilled hand all seem to converge there. What had been scattered across the plain becomes concentrated. 5. Even the silence of earlier centuries begins to feel less empty, as if it had been quietly preparing the weight of this arrival. Still, 5. The question remains gentle but persistent. How did people learn to live at this scale after so many unwritten ages? 5. How many forgotten experiments failed before Uruk succeeded? How many older customs were absorbed into its temples, workshops, and records? The city answers some questions by existing, but it creates others by the very size of its achievement. From outside, Uruk may appear as architecture and administration. But inside its walls, if we imagine carefully, it was also a living human world. 5. To understand its meaning, we must walk from its structures into its streets. 5. Among the people who made the first urban dream breathe together for the first time. 5. To walk toward an early city like Uruk would have been to feel the world grow louder before it became clear. First, 5. There might be dust on the horizon, lifted by feet, animals, carts, and wind. Then the walls, or the outer edges of dense settlement, 5, would begin to separate themselves from the flat land. Beyond them rose temple platforms, pale against the sky, built from mud brick and labor. 5. Visible from far enough away to change the feeling of the journey. A village belonged to the land around it. City seemed to gather the land into itself. At the entrance, the senses would meet too much at once. Voices, hooves, the smell of animals, grain, smoke, damp clay, sweat, reeds, and cooked food. Workers carrying baskets, traders watching their goods, children moving between adults. 5. Potters near kilns, weavers near shaded rooms, people arriving from fields, canals, and settlements beyond the city's edge, bringing offerings. 5. Produce, news, labor, and questions. Inside, life had a different rhythm. Not everyone knew everyone. That alone may have felt strange. In a village, 5. Memory could live in faces. In a city, memory needed marks, seals, officials, and places of record. 5. A person could pass strangers every day and still belong to the same larger order. The city created a new kind of closeness, crowded but impersonal. 5. Shared, but not always intimate. Near the sacred precinct, the atmosphere would change again. The temple platform rose above ordinary movement. 5. Drawing the eye upward. Around it, rituals unfolded according to calendars older than any one household. Grain was brought in. Animals were prepared. 5. Offerings were counted. Priests, workers, and attendants moved through spaces where practical labor and sacred duty were woven together. 5. The gods were not distant ideas here. Their presence shaped storage, work, ceremony, authority, and time. Somewhere nearby, 5. A scribe or trained official press signs into wet clay. The act was small, almost quiet, but it changed everything. A delivery could be remembered. 5. A promise could be fixed. A quantity of grain could remain present after the speaker had left. In the city, memory began to harden into objects. 5. For those who had come from smaller settlements, this world may have felt both wondrous and unsettling. The city offered protection, exchange, ritual, 5. And possibility. It also demanded obedience, labor, measure, and attention. It asked people to imagine themselves not only as members of families, 5, but as parts of something larger, something built from many hands and watched by powers above them. Even at night, 5, when fires lowered and streets softened into shadow, the city would not become a village again. It stored grain, sealed rooms, sacred platforms, 5, and sleeping crowds held a new form of human possibility. This was the first urban dream. Not only houses gathered together, 5, but human life reorganized around scale. The city became a new way of seeing the world, 5, and hidden inside its walls was another question. What memories had this new world carried forward from the ages before it? 5. A city remembers differently than a village. In a village, memory can live in faces, habits, footpaths, and stories repeated around the same hearth. 5. But when a city grows large, memory must be given places to rest. It settles into walls, storerooms, temple platforms, sealed jars, carved seals, 5. Counted grain, and wet clay tablets left to dry in the sun. The city becomes more than a home for people. 5. It becomes a machine for preserving what the human voice alone can no longer hold. Every wall carries memory. It shows where people chose to defend, 5. Divide, shelter, and gather. Every rebuilt temple platform remembers the sacred ground beneath it, 5. Even when those who laid the first bricks are long gone. Every canal holds the memory of labor repeated season after season. Every tablet, 5, even one that records only sheep or grain, preserves a small moment of trust, obligation, and order. 5. This is why the first cities may not have erased the forgotten age. They may have stored it in new forms. 5. Older rituals could become temple ceremonies. Older gathering places could become sacred precincts. 5. Older leaders of work and memory could become officials, priests, or kings. Older stories of flood, survival, and divine instruction could be copied. 5. Reshaped and protected by scribes. What once moved through breath and gesture began to harden into architecture, ritual, and record. City also needs an identity. It must know who it is, where it came from, which god watches over it, which ancestors matter. 5. Which stories explain its right to exist. For this reason, early cities did not only build houses and store grain, they built origins. 5. They surrounded themselves with sacred memory. They placed their beginnings in the deep past, near gods, rivers, sages, kings before ordinary kings. 5. And events that seemed to divide one age from another To modern eyes, this can feel like myth added after the fact. And sometimes it was political, 5, symbolic, or theological. But myth can still preserve a pattern of remembrance. When a city says its wisdom came from before the flood, fide, it may be making a sacred claim. It may also be pointing backward toward a time its people could no longer describe directly. The first city then, 5, was not only a concentration of people, it was a concentration of memory. It gathered the practical memory of fields and canals, 5, the sacred memory of ritual, the social memory of authority, and the fragile memory of older stories into one living structure, 5. Its streets became pathways, not only for bodies and goods, but for inherited meanings, moving quietly from the past into the present, 5. And if the forgotten age survived anywhere, perhaps it survived there, hidden inside the very institutions that seemed to replace it. In the temples, 5, in the tablets, in the names of cities, in the stories whispered about kings before the flood and wisdom, brought from beyond ordinary time, 5. To follow those traces now, we must leave the streets and enter the records, 5. Among the most mysterious records from ancient Mesopotamia is a list of kings. At first, that may sound simple. A list suggests order. 5 names placed one after another. Cities connected to rulers. Reigns counted and arranged, as if history could be held still by writing. 5. But the Sumerian king list is not an ordinary record in the modern sense. It does not give us history cleanly separated from myth, politics, theology, 5, and memory. It moves through a world where kingship is not merely human power, it is something that descends from heaven, 5. The list begins in a time before the flood. There, in that distant age, kings rule for lengths of time that seem impossible by ordinary human measure, 5. Their reigns stretch across thousands and tens of thousands of years. Cities rise in the record with a strange, almost dreamlike weight. Eridu, Bad Tabira, Larak, Sippar, Shurupak. The names feel half historical, half symbolic, standing at the edge of written memory, 5. Then comes the dividing line. The flood sweeps over. Afterward, kingship descends again, 5. And the list continues in a world that slowly feels closer to recognizable human time. For ancient Mesopotamians, this division mattered. 5. The flood was not just a story of water. It was a boundary in the structure of memory. Before it, time seems vast, sacred, and difficult to measure. 5. After it, kingship resumes, cities continue, and order returns. 5. The list does not explain the forgotten age between catastrophe and visible civilization, 5 Kanzweki. But it points toward the idea that history itself had been broken and renewed. Scholars often read the Sumerian king list as more than a chronicle. 5. It helped later rulers place themselves inside a sacred chain of authority. It joined different cities into one imagined sequence. 5. It gave political power a divine and ancient origin. In that sense, the list is not a neutral document. It is a crafted memory, 5, shaped by belief and purpose, yet that does not make it meaningless. Mythic records can preserve questions that ordinary records cannot. 5. Why imagine kings before the flood at all? Why place cities on the far side of catastrophe? Why describe kingship as something lost, then restored? 5. These ideas suggest that Mesopotamian tradition remembered civilization not as a simple straight line, but as something interrupted. 5. The antediluvian kings may not be historical rulers in the way later kings were. Their enormous reigns belong to mythic time, 5, where meaning matters more than measurement. But mythic time can still carry a truth of feeling. It says, there was a before, there was a break, 5, there was an after. And in that quiet space between before and after, the hidden memory deepens. If kingship survived as an idea, then perhaps other things were imagined to survive as well. Wisdom, ritual, instruction, and the knowledge needed to rebuild a world. That trail leads from kings toward the sages. In Mesopotamian memory, knowledge often arrives through figures who are not quite ordinary. The sages, 5 to Bigging Sive, often connected with the tradition of the Apkallu, stand near the deep beginnings of civilization. They are remembered as beings of wisdom, 5, linked with the arts that allow human life to become ordered. Ritual, purification, building, measurement, writing, 5, and the proper relationship between gods and people. Some traditions place them close to the time before the flood. 5. Others connect them with early kings and sacred cities. They seem to belong to the borderland between myth and memory. In the stories, 5. These sages are not simply clever humans, they carry a strange authority. Some are described in forms that blend human and non-human qualities. 5. Sometimes associated with water and the hidden depths. This symbolism matters. Water, in Mesopotamian thought, was not only danger. 5. It was also the deep source of wisdom, fertility, and creation. 5. To say that knowledge came from beings connected with the deep was to say that civilization itself emerged from a sacred and mysterious source. 5. One layer of interpretation takes these traditions as theology. The sages represent divine instruction. Humanity does not invent order alone. 5. Order is given, revealed, or guided by powers older than human society. In this view, 5. The arts of civilization carry sacred weight because they come from beyond ordinary life. 5. A second layer reads the sages more historically and symbolically. They may reflect priestly knowledge, scribal lineages, temple learning, 5, and the prestige of ancient ritual specialists. 5. The strange forms and supernatural details may express the way. Later Mesopotamians imagined the authority of their own learned traditions. 5. A priest who knew purification rites, a scribe who understood old texts. 5. Or an expert who preserved temple knowledge could be linked backward to these primeval teachers. 5. And then there is the open question that makes the tradition so fascinating. 5. Could these sages also preserve a blurred memory of real teachers from a rebuilding age? People who knew how to measure land, manage water, store grain, observe stars, build sacred spaces, and maintain social order after disruption. Over long centuries, such figures could become enlarged. Their practical wisdom could be remembered as divine wisdom. Their survival knowledge could become the gift of civilization. Their names, 5, if they ever had ordinary names, could dissolve into titles, symbols, and sacred forms. 5s. This does not prove that the Apkallu were literal beings from another world, nor does it reduce them to empty invention. 5. The deeper value lies in the pattern. Mesopotamian tradition imagined knowledge as something precious enough to be guarded, transmitted, 5, and traced back to a time beyond ordinary history. After catastrophe, this idea becomes even more powerful. 5. A society that fears forgetting may tell stories about those who remembered everything necessary. 5. The sage becomes the answer to a human fear, that without knowledge the world cannot begin again from bare earth. So the next question is simple, 5, but important. What kind of knowledge would have mattered most if a world had to be rebuilt? 5. The knowledge needed to rebuild a world would not have looked mysterious at first glance. 5. A whiskers. It may have looked like a farmer pressing seed into soil at the right depth in the right season, after watching the river withdraw. 5. It may have looked like someone measuring a field with cord, so that water could be shared without tearing a community apart. 5. It may have looked like a ritual speaker marking the proper day for planting, harvest, purification, burial, or offering. These were ordinary acts. 5. But in the ancient world, ordinary acts could hold civilization together. Farming had to survive. Without the knowledge of grain, soil, storage, 5, and seasons, no settlement could grow for long. A seed is small, but it carries a whole future inside it. To know which seeds to save, 5. When to plant them, how to protect them from damp or insects, and how to divide the harvest was to carry one of the deepest forms of power. 5. It was not the power of a weapon. It was the power of continuation. Calendars mattered, because the land did not wait for human confusion. The stars, 5 moon, river levels, heat and winds, all helped people read the year. A community that remembered time could prepare. 5 community that lost time might plant too early, harvest too late, or fail to store enough before hardship came. This is why astronomy, 5 even in its earliest forms, was never only about the sky. It was about survival on Earth. Law too had to survive. Even before law was written. 5. People needed rules for land, water, marriage, debt, labor, injury and stored food. Without social order, abundance could become conflict. 5. A canal required agreement. A granary required trust. A ritual gathering required shared expectations. 5. The hidden knowledge of civilization was not only how to build things, but how to live close enough together without breaking apart. 5. Writing and accounting later gave these patterns visible form. Marks on clay preserved quantities, names, obligations, and offerings. 5. Ritual gave them sacred rhythm. Measurement gave them fairness. Astronomy gave them timing. Together, 5. These skills formed a web strong enough to hold larger communities. So when myths speak of sages bringing knowledge, 5. The gift may not need to be imagined as something distant from daily life. The greatest gifts may have been practical. How to plant, count, measure, 5. Remember, settle, purify, build, and begin again after loss. In a world recovering from disaster, 5. Art and. Such knowledge would feel almost divine because it stood between people and chaos. This is the quiet heart of the lost knowledge theme. 5. The mystery is not only whether some hidden science vanished before history began. 5. It is whether the skills that made civilization possible were remembered as sacred, because they had once saved human life from silence, hunger, disorder, fear, and forgetting. 5. And perhaps Sumerian tradition preserved this feeling without fully explaining it. 5. Pointing backward to an age where knowledge survived before history could speak clearly in the dim generations after the ancient waters. 5. Sumerian records do not hand us the forgotten age like a finished map. They offer fragments. 5. A king list that stretches backward into impossible reigns. Flood stories that divide time into before and after. 5 sages who carry wisdom from the deep past. Cities remembered as sacred beginnings. Gods who grant order, kingship, craft, measurement, and law. Each piece glows for a moment, then disappears into uncertainty. Together, they do not give a simple history. They give a direction of memory. 5. That direction points backward. Again and again, Mesopotamian tradition seems to look over its own shoulder. 5. Toward an age that ordinary records cannot fully reach. Before familiar kings, there are older kings. Before written history, 5. There are stories of instruction. Before the city becomes a political machine, it is imagined as a sacred trust. Before human order is secure, 5. It must descend, be restored, be taught, or be remembered from somewhere older. This does not mean every line should be taken literally. But ancient records were shaped by scribes, rulers, temples, and beliefs. A king list could support political claims. 5. A myth could explain ritual authority. A story of divine wisdom could strengthen the prestige of priests and scholars. 5. These texts belong to their own world, and they speak in the language of that world, where history, theology, memory, and power were woven together. 5. But woven things can still preserve threads. Myth can compress long processes into a single image. A flood can stand for many disasters, many losses. 5. Or a remembered boundary between worlds. A sage can stand for generations of teachers, ritual experts, healers, and observers of the sky. 5. A city of origins can stand for centuries of settlement and sacred return. The record may not tell us exactly what happened, 5 of 5, but it may preserve the feeling that something had happened before the visible beginning. This is why the hidden age remains so compelling. 5. It is not clearly described, yet it is repeatedly implied. It appears as a shadow behind Sumer, in the idea that kingship existed before the flood. 5. That knowledge came from an older source, that cities were connected to sacred beginnings. 5. And that the world after catastrophe had to be ordered again. For the listener seeking certainty, this may feel unsatisfying. 5. The records do not close the mystery. They deepen it. They ask us to sit quietly with a past that is partly archaeological, partly mythic, 5, partly political, and partly emotional. 5. They remind us that the earliest written civilizations were already remembering something older than writing itself. 5. Something already distant when clay first learned to speak, in fragile fragments. 5. Perhaps Sumer did not preserve the forgotten age by explaining it directly. Perhaps it preserved it the way old earth preserves a buried wall. Broken. 5. Incomplete. But still present, if we know how to look. And when we widen our view beyond Mesopotamia, 5, we find that this backward-looking memory was not alone. Other cultures, too, remembered floods, teachers, destroyed ages, 5, and worlds rebuilt from what survived. Across the ancient world, flood stories often do more than describe destruction. They divide time itself. 5. Again and again, cultures imagine water standing between one age and another. Before the flood, there is an older world, sometimes corrupt, 5, sometimes sacred, sometimes simply distant beyond ordinary memory. Then comes the rising water, the collapse, the cleansing, 5, or the drowning of what existed before. Afterward, survivors step into a changed reality. Humanity begins again, but never completely from nothing. 5, something crosses the boundary. A family, a teaching, a sacred law, a memory, a vessel, a promise. This pattern appears in many forms. In Mesopotamia, 5, kingship descends again after the flood. In biblical tradition, Noah leaves the ark beneath a new covenant. In Greek stories, 5, Deucalion and Pyrrha repopulate the earth after destruction. In Indian tradition, 5, Manu survives through divine warning and carries life forward into renewal. Other cultures preserved different versions, shaped by local landscapes, 5, religions, and histories. Yet the emotional structure remains strangely familiar. Water becomes a doorway. 5. The importance of this pattern is not that every culture must be describing one identical event. Human societies have always lived beside rivers, 5, coasts, storms, and dangerous seas. Floods are real experiences, but flood stories endure because they also express something larger, 5. They allow people to imagine a break in continuity, a moment when the old order fails and a new one must be built carefully from what survives. 5. In many traditions, the flood is not only punishment or disaster, it is also transition. The world afterward feels morally, spiritually, 5, or socially different from the world before. Survivors carry the burden of beginning again. 5. This creates a powerful emotional image that can survive for thousands of years. Humanity standing on wet ground beneath a changed sky. 5. Holding fragments of memory while trying to rebuild meaning. 5. That emotional pattern may explain why flood stories remain so enduring across cultures separated by geography and language. 5. They speak to a universal fear of loss, but also to a universal hope that continuity can survive even when the world changes beyond recognition. 5. A destroyed settlement can be rebuilt. A sacred story can be retold. A seed can still grow after the waters withdraw. 5. for listeners drawn to the mystery of the forgotten age. 5. This repetition across traditions matters because it suggests that ancient people often imagine civilization as something fragile, not permanent. 5. Not guaranteed. Something that could be interrupted, washed away, and restored again through memory, labor, ritual, and inherited knowledge. 5. The flood, then, becomes more than an event inside myth. It becomes a symbolic threshold between worlds. And once that threshold exists, 5. Another figure almost always appears nearby. The survivor, the teacher, the guide. Part 5. Or the culture bringer who helps humanity cross from ruin into order again. So, from the waters themselves, 5. Our attention now shifts toward the mysterious teachers remembered across many ancient traditions. After catastrophe, 5. Many traditions do not leave humanity alone. Somewhere near the edge of destruction, a teacher appears. 5. Sometimes this figure is a survivor who remembers the older world. Sometimes a god, a sage, watcher, an ancestor, a messenger from the sky, 5. Or a being from the waters. The forms differ from culture to culture, and they should not be forced into one identical story. 5. Yet the pattern is striking. When disorder threatens human life, knowledge is imagined as something given, recovered, or restored. In Mesopotamia, 5. The sages associated with the deep past bring the arts that make civilization possible. They are linked with ritual, purity, building, measurement, 5, and sacred order. In other traditions, similar roles appear in different clothing. A figure teaches agriculture. Another gives fire, 5. Another reveals laws, calendars, writing, healing, or the proper way to honor the divine. Some come from mountains, some from the sea, 5. Some descend from the heavens. Some are remembered as ancestors who crossed a boundary between worlds, 5. What joins these figures is not proof that all cultures describe the same beings. It is the emotional shape of the memory. 5. Human communities often imagined their most important skills as gifts too precious to be ordinary. How to plant, how to count time, how to build. 5. How to settle disputes, how to speak with the unseen powers. These were not small inventions. They allowed life to continue after fear, hunger, 5, and confusion. This is especially meaningful after a flood or world-ending story. A survivor may live, 5, but survival without instruction remains fragile. People need more than dry land. They need a way to rebuild order. 5. The culture bringer answers that need. He or she stands between chaos and society, between loss and renewal. 5. Between the old world and the new one taking shape. Scholars may understand these teachers as symbolic figures, shaped by ritual authority. 5. Priestly memory, political identity, or the deep human habit of turning practical knowledge into sacred story. This careful view matters. 5. Myths are not simple reports. They are woven from belief, social need, and remembered experience. Still, the stories leave a quiet wonder behind. 5. Or, why does knowledge so often arrive from beyond the ordinary village? Why is civilization remembered as something received, not merely invented? 5. Perhaps because, to early communities, the skills that held life together really did feel like rescue. A person who knew when to plant, how to heal, 5, where to build, or how to read the stars could seem almost otherworldly in a time of uncertainty. So the teacher after catastrophe becomes a bridge. 5. Not necessarily a literal visitor from another realm, and not merely a fantasy either, but a symbol of remembered dependence on knowledge. 5. Across cultures. These figures remind us that rebuilding the world is never only physical. It begins with someone knowing what must be done next. 5. From there we can turn from mythic teachers toward the ground itself, where old sites, ruins, 5, and scattered traces show how rebuilding may have taken form slowly. Some places seem to wait outside the usual story of civilization. 5. They do not always look like cities. They may have no streets, no palaces, no written archives, no clear names preserved by later kings. 5. Yet when archaeologists uncover them, or when travelers stand among their stones, 5. They raise questions that feel older than the timelines we learn to expect. A circle of pillars, a buried platform. 5. A settlement mound, with layers reaching deep into prehistory. A carved symbol on stone before writing. 5. A place where people gathered long before the city became the normal measure of human achievement. Across the ancient world, 5 early ritual and settlement sites remind us that human complexity did not begin only when writing began. People were planning, gathering, building, 5, remembering, and giving meaning to places long before royal inscriptions announced their names. 5. Some communities built spaces too large or too carefully arranged to be explained as ordinary shelter. 5. Others returned to the same ground for generations, leaving behind bones, tools, offerings, floors, and signs of repeated ceremony. 5. These places do not prove one hidden civilization connecting all lands. The evidence is usually fragmentary. 5. And each site belongs first to its own landscape, culture, and time. 5. But they do challenge the feeling that early people were simple until cities suddenly made them complex. 5. Human beings were already capable of shared labor, symbolic thought, seasonal gathering, long-distance exchange, and careful memory. 5. The first cities inherited this older depth rather than creating it from nothing. For the lost civilization viewer, 5. This is where the mystery becomes both wider and more delicate. The forgotten age may not appear as one grand capital waiting under the sand. 5. It may appear as scattered signs of minds working together before history had strong walls around it. A sacred enclosure here. 5. A village beneath a mound there. A drowned shoreline, a vanished marsh settlement, a path of exchanged stone, a burial arranged with care. 5. Each fragment is small, but together they suggest a human world richer than its surviving evidence. The limits of evidence matter. Wood decays, reeds vanish, floods move earth, coastlines drown, fire destroys what hands once shaped, and long before writing, 5. Most lives passed, without leaving names behind. The absence of records is not the same as the absence of memory. 5. It only means that memory must be approached through traces. Soil color, tool marks, pottery fragments, animal bones, old walls. 5. And the quiet placement of objects in the ground. Some ancient sites make the past feel deeper than expected because they show us preparation without explanation. 5. Hubbard. They show people gathering before cities, building before kings, honoring before temples, and remembering before tablets. 5. They do not solve the forgotten age, but they make it easier to imagine. And now, before we move toward the final reflection, 5. It is worth letting these patterns rest gently in the mind. Not as a puzzle to force open, 5. But as a landscape to watch quietly beneath the slow turning of ancient stars above. For a moment, we can let the pattern rest. We do not need to force every flood story into one event, or every ancient teacher into one hidden origin. The past rarely gives itself so neatly. 5. It comes to us in broken layers. River mud, sacred words, worn stones, copied myths, ruined walls. 5. Afide. And the quiet habits of people who lived too early to leave their names behind. Some similarities may come from shared human experience. 5. Some may come from real disasters, remembered differently. Some may come from the way the mind reaches for meaning when the world has changed too much. 5. It is enough for now, simply to notice. Many cultures remembered water as a boundary. Many imagined survival as more than escape. 5. Many placed teachers, sages, ancestors, or divine figures near the beginning of order. Many built sacred places before their histories became clear. 5. These echoes do not have to become a single answer. They can remain echoes, moving softly across distance, each one belonging to its own land. 5. Yet still touching something familiar in the human heart, ancient memory is layered. One layer may be practical. A flood really came. Field was lost. A shoreline moved. A settlement had to be abandoned. Another layer may be emotional. Fear, grief, relief, gratitude. 5. The need to tell children why the old place was gone. Another layer may be sacred. The belief that the disaster meant something. 5. That renewal required ritual. That knowledge had to be guarded, because forgetting could be dangerous. Over time, 5. These layers press together until history, myth, and meaning can no longer be separated cleanly. That does not make the stories useless. 5. It makes them human, so if you are listening, you do not need to solve every connection tonight. You can let Mesopotamia, Greece, India, Mesoamerica, 5, and the older unnamed places drift like lights across dark water. You can let the names come. 5. You can rest inside the uncertainty without losing the thread. The mystery is not weakened by being unfinished. It becomes gentler, wider. 5. And perhaps more honest. The forgotten age may not be waiting for one final key. It may be a pattern of survival, memory, 5, and rebuilding that appears wherever people faced loss and tried to begin again. It may live partly in archaeology, partly in myth, 5, partly in the spaces between them. It may never stand before us whole. But scattered things can still belong to one quiet shape. 4-way stars form a constellation when the mind draws a line, and still it can be felt. Like a buried wall beneath a mound, like an old river channel under dry ground, like a story repeated long after its first teller was gone. 5. Like a memory that does not demand certainty, only patience, attention, and willingness to listen. Now, as the echoes settle, 5, we can return to the question with a calmer mind. Not only where was the forgotten age, or who lived inside it, but what was it really? 5 of 5. When people search for a forgotten age, they often imagine a single lost place, a drowned empire beneath the sea. 5. A vanished capital hidden under desert sand, towers swallowed by jungle, or buried beneath flood deposits, waiting to rise again into the light. 5. These images are powerful because they promise a clear answer. 5. One dramatic discovery that could suddenly explain the oldest mysteries of civilization. 5. But the forgotten age we have followed through this journey may not have been one place at all. It may have been a passage. 5. A long human passage between destruction and stability, between scattered survival and organized civilization. 5. Between memory carried only in the voice and memory pressed into clay. Not a hidden empire standing apart from history. 5, but a slow transformations spread across generations so quiet that later ages could only remember pieces of it. In the flood stories, 5, we saw the memory of endings. In the survivors, we saw the fragile beginning of rebuilding. In villages beneath ancient mounds, 5, we saw people learning once again how to store grain, shape tools, share labor, and live beside dangerous rivers. In sacred places, 5, we saw communities gathering around meaning before kingship fully emerged. In Sumerian cities, we saw the visible result: temples, writing, 5, and administration, and urban life rising from the plain with astonishing force. Yet by the time those cities appeared, 5, much of the real story may already have happened. The forgotten age may therefore belong to hidden labor rather than lost monuments. 5. The repair of canals, the preservation of seed, the remembering of seasons, the slow rebuilding of trust after catastrophe. 5. The passing of ritual from elder to child, the shaping of sacred places before written law. These things leave softer traces than palaces do. 5. Many disappear completely. But without them, the city could never rise. This idea changes the meaning of mystery. Sir. The hidden age is no longer only about what was lost, it is also about what survived quietly enough to be overlooked. 5. Civilization may not have begun in one brilliant moment. It may have emerged from countless acts repeated patiently across centuries, 5 to 5, until the process itself became invisible beneath its final achievement. That is why the first cities feel both familiar and strange. 5. They stand before us, fully formed enough to enter history. 5. Yet behind them stretches a dim corridor of rebuilding that archaeology can only partly illuminate. The flood stories, the sages, the sacred centers, 5, and the old settlement layers all seem to point toward that corridor without ever revealing it completely. 5. So perhaps the forgotten age is best understood not as a missing kingdom, but as a missing transition, a buried bridge between worlds. 5. And if that is true, then the greatest mystery may not be where the lost age disappeared. 5. It may be how memory itself carried fragments of it forward through myth, ritual, sacred geography, and the first written records. 5. Until traces of that passage still remained beneath the oldest cities humanity ever built. The earth remembers in fragments, for it keeps what can survive pressure, burial, fire, water, and time. A wall line beneath a mound, a floor hardened by feet. 5. A jar broken beside a hearth. Seeds burned black but still recognizable. Bones, tools, ash, clay tablets, seal impressions. 5. And the faint stains of posts that once held a roof above sleeping bodies. Archaeology listens to these remains with patience. 5. It does not ask the past to speak loudly. It looks for small signs and builds careful questions around them. But the earth does not keep everything. 5. It does not keep most voices. It does not keep the full grief of a family leaving a flooded home. 5. Or the fear in a child watching water rise across a field. It rarely keeps songs, warnings, prayers, gestures. 5. Or the exact meaning of a ritual performed before writing. Wood decays, reed mats vanish, cloth disappears, skin returns to dust. Even clay tablets, 5 ply, strong as they seem, preserve only the moments someone chose to mark. The rest passes into silence. Stories keep something different. 5. A myth may lose the exact location of a flood, but preserve the feeling of a world divided into before and after. 5. A tale of a sage may not name an ordinary teacher, but it can preserve the belief that knowledge once saved people from disorder. 5. A story of kings before the flood may not be history in a modern sense, yet it can hold the memory of deep time, broken continuity, Fat Ka Shigel, and the longing to connect present life with older beginnings. This is why evidence and myth should not be treated as enemies. 5. They do different kinds of work. Archaeology gives us matter, mud brick, pottery, tools, dates, layers, settlement patterns. Fight myth gives us meaning, fear, hope, guilt, renewal, sacred order, and the way a people understood its place in time. One can correct the other. Fight fa, one can also deepen the other. A flood layer in the ground does not explain an entire sacred story, but it can remind us that water was real. 5. A sacred story does not prove every detail, but it can remind us that disaster was remembered emotionally, not only physically. 5. Between earth and story, the forgotten age becomes more visible, though never complete. It appears as a shadow cast by both kinds of memory. 5. In the ground, we find traces of rebuilding. In myth, we find the need to explain why rebuilding mattered. Perhaps some truths survive best in soil. 5. And others survive best in symbols. One preserves the broken jar, the other preserves the reason someone cared enough to fill it again. 5. Fakran. One gives us the wall, the other gives us the fear of being without shelter. Together, they suggest that history is not only what happened, 5, but what human beings needed to remember afterward. And somewhere between them, the ancient human experience remains. 5. Waiting quietly for us to notice how deeply people have always tried to begin again after loss. and still do even now. 5. Perhaps this mystery stays with us, because it is not only ancient. At first it seems far away. Flood stories, Sumerian cities, clay tablets, 5 lost ages, sages at the edge of memory. These belong to a world of mud brick walls and river plains, a world older than familiar nations, 5 older than most names we still speak. Yet beneath the distance, the feeling is recognizable. Something is lost, something survives. 5. Something must be rebuilt. Every human life contains smaller versions of this pattern. A home changes, a family breaks. 5. A place once known becomes unreachable. A belief that once felt solid is washed away by time, grief, age, or disappointment. After such moments, 5. People rarely rebuild all at once. They begin with small things, a meal prepared again, a room cleaned, a story retold, a tool picked up. 5. A promise kept. A path walked once more, even when it feels different than before. Perhaps this is why ancient flood stories, lost cities, 5, and forgotten ages still comfort people. They place personal uncertainty inside a much larger human rhythm. They remind us that loss is not new, 5, and neither is recovery. Long before us, people stood on altered ground and tried to understand what remained. They gathered seeds, repaired walls, 5, watched the sky, honored the dead, taught children, and made meaning from what could not be restored. The first cities may look grand from a distance, 5, but perhaps their deepest meaning is humble. They show that human beings can organize hope. They can turn memory into ritual, labor into shelter, 5, fear into warning, and survival into culture. The city rises because many small acts refuse to disappear. A canal cleared again, 5, a field planted again, a story spoken again beside fire. Civilization may be less a monument to certainty than a record of repeated beginnings. 5. For those drawn to ancient questions, there is comfort in this. The past does not have to be fully solved to be meaningful. 5. A broken tablet can still speak. A buried wall can still suggest a home. A myth can still carry a wound and a healing at the same time. But we listen, because something in us recognizes the pattern, even if we cannot name every place or date, or follow every river back to its source. 5. The forgotten age between the flood and the first cities may never be recovered completely, but perhaps that incompleteness is part of its power. 5. It leaves room for reflection. It allows the ancient world to remain alive, not as a finished answer, but as a mirror held softly in the dark. 5. And in that mirror, we see people much like ourselves, afraid of forgetting, hungry for continuity. 5. Searching for signs that life can begin again after the waters withdraw. As this journey nears its end, 5, we can return one last time to the plain itself, where the first cities stand beneath the night sky. 5. Resting on layers of memory older than their walls, and older than their first recorded names. Night settles over the southern plain. 5. The heat leaves the mud brick walls slowly, as if the city itself is exhaling after the long day. Above the roofs, the stars appear one by one. 5 below them. The temples stand in darkness, their platforms holding the last pale memory of sunset. Streets grow quieter. Storerooms are sealed. 5 fires shrink inside courtyards. Somewhere an animal shifts in its pen. Somewhere else, 5, a child falls asleep, while an older voice finishes a story that was already old. Before the first tablet dried, the city rests, but it is not empty. Inside, its walls are layers of human memory, grain from fields watered by difficult rivers, clay marked by hands that needed to count and remember. 5. Rituals performed in places made sacred by return, names of God's kings, workers, ancestors. 5. And cities carried forward because someone feared they might vanish. Beneath the visible city are older floors, older hearths, older paths. 5. And perhaps older silences than any record can reach. If the flood was a mythic boundary, then the city was one answer to what came after. 5. Not a complete answer. Not proof that every story happened exactly as later generations told it, but an answer made of labor, mud, belief. 5. And repetition. The waters withdrew, in memory or in history, and human beings built places where memory could stand upright again. 5. The forgotten age may never fully return to us. It may remain beneath the surface, scattered through settlement mounds, flood stories, sacred centers, 5 sage traditions, and the strange backward gaze of Sumerian records. It may not have been one lost empire or one hidden city waiting to be found. 5. It may have been a passage of people rebuilding carefully, carrying what they could, letting the rest become story, and yet its shadow remains. 5. It is there whenever an ancient city claims a beginning older than itself. It is there when a tablet speaks of kings before the flood. 5. It is there when a myth remembers water, survival, and wisdom. It is there in the quiet idea that civilization did not simply appear. 5. But rose from grief, adaptation, memory, and hope. So we end where we began, on the plain, under a wide sky. 5. The rivers move somewhere in the darkness. Reeds stir at the edge of old channels. Low mounds sleep under dust. The first cities stand in memory now, fight-fied, not as final answers, but as lanterns placed over deeper ground. Their light is soft, and it does not explain everything. 5. It only shows enough to let the mind keep wandering gently in the dark. Beneath them, there may still be an age we cannot name clearly. 5. An age. Between the waters and the walls, between the broken world and the built one. Perhaps that is enough for tonight, not certainty. 5. Not a sealed conclusion. Only the calm knowledge that the past is deeper than it first appears, and that somewhere beneath the oldest stories, humanity is still learning how to begin again.